Hi everyone, my name's Jack Hardinges and I'm Programme Lead at the Open Data Institute. Really pleased to be pre-recording this for Northernlands 2020 and looking forward to joining lots of the other sessions around this one next week. In this session, I'm going to be setting out two arguments in response to the question of do cities have access to the private sector data they need? In terms of an agenda, I'll first give a bit of context to the question, so where it's come from and some of the ODI's work on this so far. I'm then going to present the case for yes, cities do have access to the private sector data they need, which will feature Richard Emmett at Yorkshire Water. And then I'll follow up with some evidence in favour of no, they don't. So where we'll be hearing from Marius Jennings at Bristol City Council as well. And then I'll finish with some ideas about what might come next and open up for some live Q&A. I'll start by saying that cities have long built and maintained infrastructure. We depend on their roads and bridges, such as these nice ones belonging to Hong Kong. As well as things like their communications networks and utilities. And given that I'm speaking at a part ODI Leads event, I perhaps don't need to make the case, or much more of the case, that cities are an important lens to use to talk about infrastructure and responsibilities about building and maintaining it. At the ODI, we talk about data infrastructure. So to us, data infrastructure includes the data itself, so statistics, maps, sensor readings, as well as the people, processes, and technologies that enable it to be used. We think that data infrastructure will only become more important as our economies and our societies become ever more reliant on getting value from data, and from a city's context as more and more people end up living in urban environments. As is similar with physical infrastructure almost everywhere, a city's data infrastructure consists of data that's managed by public institutions, so housing authorities and transport authorities, as well as data that's collected and held by the private sector organisations that operate within them. So when we think about private sector city data, we talk about both data generated by businesses that work with cities to deliver public services, as well as those that provide services directly to their citizens, visitors, and others. I guess one of the underlying arguments for lots of our work on this and related topics is that we strategically plan, fund, and govern our physical infrastructure to varying degrees of success. But we're not necessarily treating or thinking about data in the same way right now. So last year, we set out a small research project as part of our R&D programme to explore the current state of city access to private sector data. And we set out to find out three things really, one of which was, do cities have access to data held by private sector organisations? How do they access that? So what types of processes, in what kinds of ways? And then also, what are the challenges to cities doing this? So what are the barriers, if we are right, that we're not necessarily thinking about city data infrastructure in the same way as physical infrastructure? I should say that when I'm talking about cities in this context, I'm using it as shorthand for city government and public sector bodies, as well as local organisations, communities, and people. So it could be researchers, startups. So when I say cities, I'm meaning something quite broad deliberately here. As you might have guessed we tried to do some of this research in the open. So this is an open document that we set up for people to contribute to and use as we went. It includes some really interesting examples of cities accessing data held by the private sector. And what we've done is set up this matrix which kind of clusters them around the purpose of the use. So is it to support innovation in a particular place, or is it more about transparency and accountability? We've also set out the role of cities, or the approaches they use to access that data. So are they collaborating with the data holders, the firms that have collected it, or are they having to, in some cases, legislate for access to it? So it's a real mix of different approaches and different examples. Been really pleased by the contributions from the community on this. So it's been quite a popular open document. So if you've added to it and are listening, thank you very much. So onto the question and the main body of the session today. So do cities have access to the private sector data they need? I'm going to be using examples from the open document I just shared to present a case for both yes and no in response to this question. And I'll say it now rather than leave it to the end, but obviously the answer is it depends. And in particular, it depends on what data you're talking about and what city. But bear with me while I present these binary polar options. It's deliberate, and I hope it's a useful way to surface some interesting and concrete examples of what's happening or not across different cities. So let's start with the yes. So firstly, we came across some really interesting examples of companies producing or commissioning research about their impact in particular places. So this is an extract from one of Airbnb's insight reports related to the West Midlands. So I think this is evidence of a recognition from some organisations that the data they've held and have collected about a particular place has value to and should be accessible to people and organisations other than just themselves. So this is my evidence point for that. Alternatively, cities can turn to some of the more specialist data providers for access to data about things like the movement of people. So this is a footfall graph from a company called SafeGraph, who generate these through access to cell phone activity data. This might be particularly useful to a city looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on movement and the local economy. Separately, there's some cool examples of cities working with the private sector to collaboratively maintain and produce data, and based on our research, in particular, lots of maps. So this is the Greater Manchester Open Data Infrastructure Map, which includes data from the private sector. So it has things like cycle network data, and the layer that I've got here is Zoopla property data. Another example is this one from Amsterdam. So this is an attempt by the city council to build a sensor registry that encourages both government departments and companies to upload the location of cameras and sensors in that particular city, mainly for transparency purposes, so people know when data about them is being collected and where. And lastly, on the case for yes, we came across some quite sophisticated attempts by companies, particularly in the transport sector, to develop services and tools that provide quite enriched access to data that their services have collected. So this is a screenshot of Strava's Metro service that enables city planners to access data to better understand trends in movement and to inform their planning and decisions about investment in transport infrastructure. I just chose this example from Louisiana as I like the name of the place. And just to say, this isn't always about static data and maps for policy making and planning. This is a picture of Transport for London's operations room. And the example that we came across was it now ingesting real-time data from the mapping service Waze, which it uses for operational traffic management. And now I'll cut to Richard for his view on this.
My name is Richard Emmett. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs for Yorkshire Water, and I've been leading our open data policy since 2018. I think there is a lot of potential for more data sharing from the private sector within cities, although I think it's come on a long way, particularly in the fields of transport. From a Yorkshire Water perspective, the key areas of data that we've been looking to share with other public service providers have been things like information on flooding, how our street works are operating, and other issues around how we employ people, such as gender diversity and how the workforce of our organisation is constituted. The way we see that as a possibility is that it means that the data sharing process can enable us to develop really strong joint partnerships with our public service provider partners to kind of improve service within the cities and to provide a much more integrated data landscape for the city. So in the first stages, what we've done to share data at Yorkshire Water is participate in Data Mill North, and we've published a whole range of data sets on there in sort of fairly raw format, but obviously that's quite static data, albeit that it has made our information accessible alongside of some of the key public service partners. The next stage of that, which we're about to launch shortly, is to run a series of consumer customizable dashboards, so that what you can do is kind of take our raw data feeds from the website and drill down into really quite local granular level to understand and analyze our performance on some of the key issues within really quite small individual communities. We think that's a really exciting possibility, and it starts to kind of create a different relationship with the public in terms of accountability and transparency. So we're really keen to get that launched and see what sort of public response we get to it. There are three real benefits for Yorkshire Water ourselves, and that's transparency, accountability, and potentially innovation. In terms of transparency, we provide an essential public service, and the public have a genuine interest in finding out how we're performing. So it's important that we're completely open about both the good and the bad of our performance. That's why, for example, we've published 5 years data worth on our pollution performance, some of which doesn't make for a great reading. It's important that people understand that. And that leads obviously to accountability. I think where we have to do more work is around how we can collaborate with other partners, potential service providers on how they can use our data to innovate and give us some different approaches to things like leakage or sewer flooding. In terms of partnership with local authorities, I've always been very conscious that taking on its own our data is useful, but it's much more useful when you put it alongside of data, say, from the Environment Agency. So if you've got some of our data on drainage planning and flooding, put that alongside some of the Environment Agency's data, say on river levels, then potentially you get a much more dynamic and rich data set that's a hell of a lot more use to potential data usage. I think most organizations see the barriers to data sharing as being, I suppose, in two sectors. One, there's a big concern about cybersecurity and data integrity, and the whole GDPR regime has been a challenge, and certainly that came in at the very early days when we were starting down our open data journey. Likewise, cyber security. Clearly, there's also a commercial sensitivity around access to some data, and there's also a general nervousness, I think, about opening the inner workings of an organisation up to the outside world. I think what we found when we've started doing things is that to some extent we've had to be fairly cavalier about some of the rules, except for GDPR, which we respected very carefully. But I remember a conversation about potential cybersecurity data on some of our water treatment works, and I discovered that the information that we're not supposed to release was actually already publicly available on Google. So it was particularly pointless to sort of maintain that restriction. So I think I'd recommend the approach that we took, which was to publish some data, see what happens. If the sky doesn't fall in and you find something interesting out as a result of it, publish some more, build your sort of risk tolerance as that happens and your skill and expertise in doing it, and also kind of build the richness of your engagement with potential data users along the way. And gradually you'll start to educate the organization that this is actually a very powerful and interesting thing to do rather than something that is challenging or difficult.
And now onto the fun part, the argument for no. And to start with, and I don't have a screenshot for this, but these are two quotes from our research that we found interesting, that kind of show the extent of the hacks and the workarounds that cities are having to put in place just to try to access data and to use it to inform their decision making. So the first involves pinging Uber and Lyft's APIs, which is interesting as a form of data collection, to say the least. I'm not sure how robust that is. And the second is an attempt to essentially replicate the data sets that these kinds of rideshare companies already have. And to me, creating that kind of shadow data set feels like fairly unnecessary effort, or effort that shouldn't necessarily need to be expended. Again, no screenshot, but a quote. So this is another that we came across that has stuck with us. So this is a description of a particular company's view of Copenhagen's data platform, describing it as parasitic and of no real benefit to the companies that the city would like to contribute data to it, has stuck with us, and some of our further research has really validated this. In particular, a piece of work that we did in 2018, which found that as a city or borough in the UK, it was nigh on impossible to find out how many properties were available on Airbnb or short-term letting sites in a particular area. Essentially, the data infrastructure didn't exist. It wasn't the case that it was broken, it just wasn't there. And this screenshot looks great, but it's not, and I'll explain why. So because the short-term letting platforms don't share data with anyone robustly, or if they do, it's for very limited research purposes, this is a service that's sprung up called AirDNA that systematically scrapes these platforms and packages up the data like this, so you can derive different kinds of stats and analysis from it. But not only is this on fairly dodgy ground from a licensing point of view in terms of whether or not the data can be scraped from the platforms in this way, if you come to any conclusions based on this data, then the platforms tend to dispute it, and because they argue that the data is inherently accurate and doesn't match up with their own internal records. So there's real limitations to what you can do with this. Lastly, on the argument for no, cities don't have access to the private sector data they need. I'd point to the various live battles in court that we came across in our research, especially in the US, between organizations like Uber and Lyft and city transport authorities over access to data as evidence of it not being there, that infrastructure not being developed or governed in the way that we need it to be. So since 2017, New York has made access to data part of its licensing conditions. So in order to operate as that particular kind of operator, then you need to provide monthly access to data that you've collected, and others seem to be following suit. And there's some controversy over whether or not some of these attempts by cities constitute overreach and the privacy implications of those. And as well as cities, drivers on these platforms are taking legal action to access data that these types of platforms hold. So this is a screenshot of James Farrow's data, who's an ex-Uber driver, and has taken them to court in part over fair access to data that the platform holds about him, in order for him to build a case, or at least to understand his employment and his the way that he was directed by the platform over a particular period of time. And now I'll cut to Marius.
My name is Marius Jennings, and I work for Bristol City Council as our open data lead. So my work is really seeing how we can work with internal partners and external partners to make open data available to support our understanding of city challenges and to promote open data in general. On reflection, I don't feel that cities currently have enough access to private data to tackle the range of challenges they face. And I think that's particularly evident at the moment. We are facing some of the most momentous change ever, and some of the most ambiguous situations that cities have had to cope with. And this has all happened really, really quickly. And this means that we're going to have to start doing things in different ways. We're going to have to start looking at our macro environment and seeing how do we experiment and what do we need. And that's a real challenge, because A, it's identifying what is the information that we need internally, and then B, how do we actually go about getting that data that may not be available. So there are a couple of initiatives that Bristol City Council are exploring. One of them came out of the ODI Open Cities workshop that we held in December 2019. And what that really gave was an opportunity for us to bring together a range of stakeholders to see what data is available and really map our ecosystem and understand what are the ethical considerations when you're getting data from different parties, and how do you share that information, and understanding what context is it suitable to share that data. So some of that data on the data spectrum may be freely available that we would want to share with anybody. Some of that might, however, be quite confidential and not appropriate. And how do you best go about it in a legally compliant way where you are seen as a trusted provider? One of the things that we're looking at in Bristol City Council is working with our procurement team, so that as new contracts are put into place, we look at social value and ask private sector companies to provide data that is not necessarily commercially sensitive with the council to kind of help shape our understanding of our city and provide that data in meaningful ways with our citizens. And another initiative that we're involved in is called the Bristol One City Plan. And it's the city's aspirations for where we want to be by 2050. And what that really does is it moves from the council taking ownership for those goals to rather a collective co-design piece where we work with city stakeholders to make the city a fairer place, while making it a cleaner, more economically viable city. And what that means is that we're having various KPIs that we need to look at on a yearly basis and working with our city partners so that we can make that information available to monitor how we're progressing. So unfortunately, there are a number of limitations around sharing data in terms of the private sector sharing and local councils so that it can be used in an effective manner and derive the best value. So some of those things are, A, is there a business case to do this? At the end of the day, often councils don't necessarily have the data science or the GIS or business intelligence teams who can devote the time to take data that's given and really extrapolate the value. It often means that there isn't the understanding from private sector organizations on the sort of data that you're asking for. And that may mean that there's quite a low risk appetite where they're not necessarily engaged because they're not seeing the value of that. There may be user agreements that are in place that hamper the availability of data. There may be potential commercial sensitivities around the data. So there are a number of things that have to be taken into account and addressed before you can do this in an effective manner. So I do have a number of recommendations for improving the situation, and particularly about how we get to work more effectively with private sector organizations. I think one of the main things is education. It's been going out there and really talking about the benefit of providing that data, trying easing the private sector organizations' concerns and showing that often customers are really interested in knowing how they're doing, and if they are having that interest in that honesty and transparency, that's often quite well received. And though they may not be performing as well on some of the issues, it doesn't mean that they're going to be criticized for that if they're doing it in quite a transparent way. I think there also needs to be a better understanding with organizations and also in councils around GDPR. Often that gets utilized as an excuse, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, particularly if you're looking at more open data or the data is being shared in a compliant way that is taking into account concerns. I think there are also circumstances where councils will automatically have powers to access certain data, like if there was a major incident. That often means that different organizations come together to enable the city's civil contingency plans. So some of this work does happen in the background, but people may not be aware of it. I probably would also say tackle one thing at a time. It's complex. And if you have already got existing relationships with private sector organizations, spend the time with them, understand what they're doing. For example, we work quite closely with Bristol Waste, to be fair, which is a Bristol City Council owned company, but really what they do is share how they're performing and how they're able to recycle more each year, and that enables us to understand how Bristol responds to the climate emergency, where we're trying to be carbon neutral by 2030. And I think if there can be seen mutual goals being aligned by this data sharing, people might be more engaged to do it. Also, I think you need to have quite an honest discussion internally and review what capacity you've got to utilize this data, because there's no point in going out there and getting it and then finding that you're not actually able to interpret effectively or share effectively. There needs to be support that the local council's giving to the external organization so that that data is used in the most effective way.
And so to wrap up, what next? And from my point of view, the real conclusion from our work so far is that while there are some really promising examples of open collaborative access to data between cities and the private sector, this isn't spread evenly, and there remains a lot more to be done. This is actually the first time that we presented some of our findings from this research. And so ideally we'd like to go further, and if it's useful, to produce some guidance for cities or for companies thinking about this issue based on the things that we've come across and what might constitute best practice. Even better would be a pilot or two or some practical work in this topic. So if you are one of those two groups, then do let me know if you're interested in talking to us and potentially working with us. For cities, we also run an online workshop that came out of the project that I described, where we use tools such as our data ecosystem mapping tool and the data ethics canvas to help cities understand current gaps in their data infrastructure, or to identify the ethical implications of increased data access or a new data project. And for private sector data holders, we actually have a series of webinars at the moment that are working through similar topics to the one that I've covered today. So do have a look on our website for those if they're of interest. And I'll stop there to take any questions you have or ideas you wanted to share. Thank you for listening.